Vladimir Putin went to China in February 2022. A few days later, Russia invaded Ukraine, and the world has not been the same since. 2 years have passed, and Putin goes to China again this week. Will the second visit have the same impact as the first? What does it mean for the world? And what does it mean for financial markets? Xi Jinping calls Putin his best friend. China and Russia describe their partnership as better than an alliance. However, the two countries have not always been on such friendly terms. Mao Zedong never forgot the betrayal by Joseph Stalin, who refused to send infantry and army units into the Korean War, letting China face the UN army alone. After Stalin died, Sino-Soviet relationship deteriorated further. Mao called Nikita Khrushchev, Stalin's successor, a revisionist and Russian imperialist, and rejected his doctrine of peaceful coexistence with the West. Later, Khrushchev severed all relations with China after Mao criticized his handling of the Cuban Missile Crisis. This came to be known as the Sino-Soviet split. During the 1969 war between the Soviet Union and China, Leonid Brezhnev had actually ordered the deployment of nuclear missiles against China, and held back only because Richard Nixon threatened to retaliate by launching nuclear missiles at Soviet cities. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. When it comes to China-Russia relations during the Cold War and since, the only constancy is that the two countries tend to close ranks when they both feel threatened by the US. Like right now. Whereas Donald Trump did everything to keep China and Russia apart, calling Xi a great leader and Putin a strong leader, US foreign policy under Biden has gone out of its way to push China and Russia together by treating them as the new axis of evil. A three-legged table does not wobble. The world was more stable when the US, China, and Russia kept their distance from each other. Biden's idealistic but aggressive foreign policy upset this equilibrium. The new strategic partnership between China and Russia is its direct consequence. I believe the meeting between Xi and Putin this week will accelerate the forces of collision between the unipolar and the multipolar world orders. It's unlikely a coincidence that Putin's trip to China came in the same week that the US announced new tariffs on Chinese imports, and a week after Russia opened a new front in its war with Ukraine. What the new US tariffs tell us is that the threat delivered in person by Antony Blinken to Xi Jinping 2 weeks ago to stop supporting Russia or face US punishment fell on deaf ears. Tellingly, Xi told Blinken during his visit that America cannot say one thing and do another. The Chinese leadership has lost all trust in the Biden administration that is now convinced is determined to slow China's development at all costs. Indeed, the tariffs should be viewed as the clearest evidence that China chose punishment over reducing its support for Russia. China's decision to continue supporting Russia likely also reflects the reality that for China to have any shot at challenging the global hegemony of the US, China needs to join forces with like-minded countries. Countries that also would like to see a redistribution of power in the world. China pushed hard for the expansion of the BRICS, but it knows that it will struggle to unify the BRICS countries like India without Russia. Russia needs China, but China needs Russia just as much, and not just for its oil and gas. This is why China cannot afford to allow Russia to lose in the Ukraine war. This is how we should interpret the no-limits partnership between the two countries. I don't think it was a coincidence that Russia launched the Kharkiv offensive before Putin's visit to China. Maybe Russia is sensitive to the fact that China would not want to be seen as having any part in how the war is being directed. But more likely, The new offensive is meant to help Putin to assure the Chinese that Russia has the momentum in the war. If Putin's China visit in 2022 was intended to explain and get the buy-in from Beijing for his decision to go to war with Ukraine, I think he went to China this week to present his plan for winning the war. According to the latest Unbound military conflict risk survey, 62% of Ukrainians would not support a peace agreement that commits Ukraine to never joining NATO, and that Zelensky still has the support of about half of his people. Putin needs a decisive victory to create the conditions for political settlement. Even more than ammunition, right now the biggest issue facing the Ukrainian army is manpower. This week, the head of Ukrainian military intelligence told the New York Times that he was using all the reserve units he had. Unfortunately, we don't have anyone else in the reserve, he said. Given Ukraine is running out of men, Russia's decision to open a new front in Kharkiv and Sumy is likely designed to stretch Ukrainian defenders even thinner before launching a major offensive. Russia likely sees a window of opportunity before the new Ukrainian conscripts from the current mobilization drive are ready to join the front line. My prediction is that over the next month, Russia will launch a major offensive with the aim to take the heavily defended Chasiv Yar, Seversk, and Kupiansk. The purpose will be to convince Ukraine and NATO to lower their war aims. The Czech president said this week in a Sky News interview that it is naive to think that Ukraine will be able to regain the occupied territories from Russia in the foreseeable future. Given NATO has little appetite for sending troops into Ukraine, I suspect we'll be hearing more talk like this between now and the Ukraine Peace Conference to be held in Switzerland in mid-June. My guess is that Xi Jinping went to Europe last week to gauge the appetite for negotiation and to position China as a mediator in any future talks. The Ukraine war has been a liability for China, but a Russian victory will give Beijing leverage in its dealing with the US and Europe. Meanwhile, China has yet to announce how it will respond to the latest US tariffs. The tariffs are designed to target the three strategic sectors that China has invested heavily and is currently the global leader. Biden raised the tariffs on Chinese EVs from 25% to 100%, the tariff on lithium EV batteries from 7.5% to 25%, and the tariff on photovoltaic cells for making solar panels from 25% to 50%. China hardly exports any EVs to the US, so the 100% tariffs on Chinese EVs is more symbolic than anything else. However, bigger impact could come from Chinese EV exports to Europe. That counted for more than 1/3 of Chinese EV exports in 2023. The US tariff on Chinese EV is very likely to strengthen the China hawks in Brussels, like Ursula von der Leyen, who have been making the case for higher tariffs on Chinese EVs. There are already reports of unsold Chinese EVs piling up at European ports. If the European Union were to increase its tariffs on Chinese EVs, China will likely respond in kind. I think the risk of an all-out trade war in the second half of 2024 is very high. I expect the RMB to be a major casualty. This will be especially the case if China decides not to fire back with its own protectionist policies. With the price war already heating up among Chinese EV producers, a weaker RMB may be the only way to ease the pressure on their profit margins. In my central scenario, we will see an intensification of the Russia-Ukraine war and the breaking out of a trade war between China and the G7 in the coming weeks and months. If I'm right, there will be ripple effects to stoke tension in other conflict zones in the world. One such hotspot is in the South China Sea. A trilateral deal between the US, Philippines, and Japan signed last month followed a visit by Blinken to Manila, during which he reiterated US commitment to respond to any Chinese attack as required by the US-Philippines Mutual Defense Treaty. Regardless of who is in the right with respect to their territorial claims in the South China Sea, tension between China and the Philippines is heating up. Since last August, China has regularly carried out harassment operations to disrupt the Philippines' attempts to resupply its troops at Second Thomas Shoal, which are stationed aboard a grounded warship. A potential escalation could arise from either the Philippines or China deciding to find out how much the new affirmed U.S. security guarantee for the Philippines is worth. Another hot spot is, of course, the Gaza war that is entering into its most dangerous phase as Israel gets ready to go into Rafah. Russian success in Ukraine might embolden Iran and its proxies to step up their attacks on Israel. Hezbollah earlier this week mounted its deepest strike in Israel since the start of the war. One of its 2 explosive drones managed to evade Israeli air defense and struck a sensitive military facility. A day later, the Iran-backed Islamic Resistance in Iraq launched 2 kamikaze drones at Eilat that were shot down by Israeli fighter jets. I suspect these attacks are just a prelude of what's to come in the coming weeks. Putin's visit to China in 2022 unleashed a war that has polarized the world. Putin's visit to China this week will harden the resolve of the 2 opposing camps. I think we will see Russia launching a major offensive in Ukraine in the coming weeks. I think a new trade war could break out over the next few months as China responds to the latest US tariffs. I think the risk of an accident in South China Sea that could drag the US into a direct conflict with China has grown. I think the war between Israel and Iran and its proxies may be only getting started. I hope I'm wrong, but with VIX falling this week to a 5-year low, I would argue it's better to be safe than sorry.